on this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio.
I compare tarot cards, reading tarot cards, kind of like to dream analysis. And I do think that all of these symbols are saying something about our subconscious and what's going on with us. And when I'm reading for someone else, I may not know exactly what's going on with you or your life, but I can tell you these symbols, and you are applying it with me as I'm explaining. So it is very much a joint process when you're reading for someone else. And I think that all of those symbols on the cards, they're so key in telling a story, just like dreams. And it really can show up what's important to someone, what path they're on, what they're dreading, what they're wishing for, all of that.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this week's episode, I am joined by Julia Gordon-Bramer to discuss her book, Tarot Life Lessons, Living Wisdom from the Major Arcana. Julia discusses how tarot is a tool of transformation, finding stories in the cards, the benefit of reading reversals, reading for difficult people, and how tarot imagery is found in the poetry of Sylvia Plath. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Julia Gordon-Bramer is a professional tarot card reader, award-winning writer and poet, Sylvia Plath scholar, former professor for the graduate writing program at Lindenwood University, and host of the radio show, videocast, and podcast Mystic Fix. She has appeared on MTV, Nickelodeon, and many television and radio shows to share her tarot talents and scholarship. Recognized as one of St. Louis's top 10 psychics and St. Louis's best fortune teller, she is the author of several books, including Fixed Stars Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath. She joins me today to discuss her latest book, Tarot Life Lessons. Julia, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm very excited to speak with you. I enjoyed your book quite a bit, and we have something in common. Based on what you wrote in the book, we both started working with tarot at around the same time. I also started
Oh,
reading tarot when I was 16 years old. So I'm
great.
like, oh, yes, we've both been at this for quite some time. And I thought that,
Uh, yeah,
yeah, and I thought that it might be
it,
interesting
it
to
it's
ask you how that came into your life. Yeah.
oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I address it in the first chapter, which is actually chapter 0 in alignment with the Fool
Mm.
card. Each chapter in Tarot Life Lessons is matched to one of the major arcana cards, and the first story is my own. And I do think, age 16, we're certainly not adults yet, not we don't have any real wisdom, but we're old enough to kind of venture out on our own, and we're looking to find ourselves, and so I can see why you might have fallen into the same situation as me. So the story I tell in the book is one of wandering into a store in the mall on a hot summer day. And it was like a magic shop. And to date myself here, back in the 1970s, there were not these spiritual new age shops that we have today. You couldn't go and buy the crystals and the sage and Palo Santo and pendulums and that sort of thing. The magic shops of the 1970s were magician tricks and gag gifts and rabbits and hats. And it just so happened they had a pack of tarot cards there as well. So the story I tell is this very worldly older woman of probably about 20 years old who motioned me over to the case and said, "Do you want to see some real magic?" And she showed me this deck, and that was it. I was smitten and plonked down my babysitting money, and and the rest is history.
Mm. Wonderful. Do you recall knowing anything about tarot before then?
No, I don't think I'd even heard of what tarot
Mm.
cards were. I was very young and naive. So I hadn't seen them in movies. Oh, wait a minute. I probably had seen the Hermit card on the Led Zeppelin album.
Oh,
And I think
okay.
it's Led Zeppelin 4.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't think I knew that that was a tarot image until later.
Right.
So yeah, the kind of thing I started to put it together. The Lover's card and the James Bond movie Live and Let Die and the Death card, those came as a little bit of an older person, but the tarot came first, and I did not know anything about what tarot was until I had that deck in my hands.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I think that I'm not entirely positive, but I think that my first exposure was the old, I think it was an RKO movie, The Wolf Man with Lon Chaney. I think there was a gypsy
Mm.
woman reading tarot
Uh-huh.
cards. I think that was the first time I'd ever seen them. So, were you hooked right away?
Pretty much. Yeah. I talk in the book about I didn't study tarot for a long time. I didn't have any books. I had only the little white booklet that came in the deck, and what's known in tarot circles today as the LWBs, because there's an art to writing those booklets. But I think that actually worked in my favor because I trained myself to use my intuition. And so I had a couple of words that were associated with each card because that's all the little white booklets had room for. So it would say like, 3 of Cups, joy, feasting, and that would
Right.
be it, and I'd have to intuit the rest. And so I learned really that way just by looking at the pictures. I I compare tarot cards, reading tarot cards, kind of like to dream analysis. And I do think that all of these symbols are saying something about our subconscious and what's going on with us. And when I'm reading for someone else, I may not know exactly what's going on with you or your life, but I can tell you these symbols, and you
Mm,
are applying it with me as I'm explaining. So
mm,
it is very much a joint process when you're reading for someone else. And I think that all of those symbols on the cards, they're so key in telling a story, just like dreams.
mm.
And it really can show up what's important to someone, what path they're on, what they're dreading, what they're wishing for, all of that.
Yeah. Now, in the book, you wrote that, I think a lot of people think of tarot in terms of predicting the future. And
Mhm.
you wrote that using it only for fortune telling is a waste of its power. And so I was wondering
Yeah.
if you could discuss that a little bit more.
Yeah. So the tarot is a tool for self-actualization, reaching your highest potential. Carl Jung used it with his patients, and it's becoming aware of where you are now, what your energies are, what your focuses are, what your fears are. We're not always aware of that kind of thing, and it's bringing it down to a conscious level, and then it gives you the power to, basically move forward in a way that you want versus what might be controlling you subconsciously that you're not aware of. So it's about awareness more than
Mm,
anything else. I believe I can read your cards because we're connected just by being alive. I call that life force God. Here's where it gets a bit spiritual. I don't tell people how to do God, what to call God. You could say energy, you could say the force, you could say a vibe, you apply it what you like. But the idea is if we're both alive, then we're hooked into this God system. And you have great power, as we all do. And it's just 99% of the people don't own that power. So I'm about teaching people to own it and saying, all right, this is what you're doing. This is where you're headed. Let's change this aspect. You seem to repeat relationship problems, or you seem to be on a treadmill with money, or and we'll look into that and we'll try to find out why. I've had some clients tell me that they've gotten more out of one tarot session than a year of therapy. and which I think is the highest compliment. And I don't take credit for that. I give credit to spirit for that. I'm just the channel. But it's about awareness. It's not fortune telling. Even though I have that label, CBS Radio called me St. Louis's best fortune teller,
Right.
and I kind of cringe a little bit on that.
Yeah.
But sure, there's a little bit of that in it, but there are opportunities to change your future as well.
Yeah. You also said that you weren't all that entirely comfortable by being called a psychic either, that you prefer intuitive.
Yeah, well, it's right. But first of all, I do believe that everybody has some psychic or intuitive abilities. And it's just about, teaching ourselves to pay attention and cultivating them, and having a spiritual path really helps. But, people hear psychic and they think of Madame Cleo and however many dollars a minute. And while I do have prices for my time, I don't want to be, that classic, again, that gypsy fortune teller
Yeah.
image. People compare me more to a life coach. They definitely seek me for guidance. They seek me for understanding certain situations. They seek me for knowing what's going on with someone else. That's something tarot can be really helpful with, is if you're estranged with somebody, if you've had a breakup and you want to understand what the other person is feeling, if someone's passed on and you want to know that they're cool with you on the other side, or maybe there's a message for you from that person. I don't profess to be a medium per se, but the tarot can help with things like that as well. You're going to hear me not want to adopt a lot of these titles: medium, psychic, fortune
Yeah.
teller. I really want to be very human about it,
Mm. Yeah.
and not be putting on a shtick. And I think that is why I have been, probably the most successful full-time tarot card reader, certainly in my area, because I am real. People sometimes meet me and they go, "Oh, you're normal." They expect me to have, the headband on and the big hoop earrings, and I can put that on for Halloween or something, but I'm very much, I'm in my workout clothes right now.
Yeah.
And I'm very real.
Yeah. Well, I like that the way
Yeah,
you
and
just,
and to add about the book,
well, please go ahead.
oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, to add about the book, I like that I don't want people to see me as this guru on a mountaintop pronouncing truths. I'm not giving the Zen koans. I'm a very human person processing with my clients. Sometimes they're challenging me, sometimes they're aggravating me, sometimes I'm crying with them. Sometimes I'm losing my boundaries. So you're going to see a very human experience from my perspective, because these did start out as my journal entries,
Mm.
and Tarot Life Lessons. My working title was the Tarot Diaries,
Mm.
and they were actually my my personal, if I had a really powerful session with somebody, I wanted to remember it, and I wanted to remember what cards I pulled for them, and I wanted to remember things they said. And as a creative writer and poet, which I also am, I recorded some of that dialogue, and I wrote it all for myself with no plan initially of ever publishing it. But in 2020 with COVID, my husband suggested I pull it together and put it in a book, and great idea on his part.
Yeah. Well, it's a very different tarot book because it's not a guidebook on this is how you read tarot. It is stories.
Right. And that was important. There are too many of those. And that has been, there are a lot of great ones. I would never put any of those down. I didn't want my book to do that. I wanted my book to be real world application of tarot, and let's see it in real human lives, and let's see how these cards actually work to transform people and change their ideas. And so, and me too, as the tarot card reader, if you're interested in the tarot side of it, how does Julia read the cards, and how is she processing when she's got this client with all these problems, or is she judging this person? I see a lot of interesting stuff. That the stories, you're going to see scam artists, you're going to see gold diggers, you're going to see a murder, you're going to see manslaughter that was covered up. You're going to see the death of children. You're going to see an impersonator of me, which was kind of weird.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting stuff. And so it was really a period of growth for me in going through these readings, and just figuring out my place and trying to be a positive force of love and light in all situations. And I was not always successful. I'd like to think in most of them I was usually successful, but there were a couple. I'm thinking of chapter 5, the Hierophant, where a woman was very challenging and difficult. And, you know, I was pretty snippy to her in the end, and like, oh, well, don't let the door hit you on the way out,
Right.
but it was, she pushed my buttons. And I talk about that, and I talk about my ego, and I am human, and ego gets in the way, and I try not to be. I try to be that blank slate, and I try to be just the channel. But if you're going to be real confrontational with me, there's that part of me that's like, bring it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
you'll see all of that.
Yeah. No, I was going to ask you about that specific example from the Hierophant, and kind of larger question about reading for people that may be a challenge, because I think something
Yeah.
that comes across very clearly in the book that's not necessarily stated explicitly, but with a tarot reading, it's you've got the cards, but you also have the reader, but then you also have, the querent, the person that's getting the reading. And it's not just the reader and the cards, it's a mutual kind of relationship between the two people and the cards.
It is. It is. And some people are blocked. Some people, like in that Hierophant story, she was not going to open enough to be vulnerable in any way. And I wasn't going to get anything. And I knew this. And so I talked about kind of dancing around and being vague, and, because I didn't have a chance with her. Someone I did not write about in this book, but once I was working an event, and parties are interesting because the individual is not usually personally invested in the reading, meaning that the host of the party usually pays for my time. And so anybody can wander up, and they don't necessarily care about tarot. They don't necessarily want to take it seriously. They may be drunk. I get all kinds of mixed energies there. And I had one a long time ago. I almost feel like I don't attract this kind of energy anymore. But this young guy sat in front of me, and he took my cards and he threw them in my face. And
Wow.
he said, they're just a lot of cardboard. And he made a big mess. And we were outdoors, so I had to get my cards quick before the wind swept them all away. And, it was just obnoxious. So I get some, there would be no way I could give that man a reading. Also, there's bias, and I have written about this. At the end of each chapter, I have tarot tips. And so if you are interested in reading the cards for yourself, you can see some of my tips after my 45 plus years of doing this. And the bias thing is huge. So I generally don't read for myself too often, because I care, I care about my outcome usually. Now, if I can be really open about it, if I can say, do I want to go to vacation in this place or this place? Maybe the cards will give me some good guidance on that. But if I ask, will my son be safe while he's on tour with his band? I care about that,
Yeah.
and I'm too invested in that outcome. So, I in general practice, I don't read for my family members, and I usually don't read for myself. Those really close loved ones, because I might be too wound up in that and I might want to sway it in some way.
Yeah, yeah. It is very difficult to read for yourself because of bias. I often what I've done now is when I do have a question, I will just do a one card pull. And I'll give you two
Mm,
examples. Actually, I'll give you three. One, because I think the interesting thing about tarot is that sometimes it's clear, sometimes there's a little bit of ambiguity. So I struggled for a long
yeah.
time making a decision. I had been in California and I moved back to Colorado this past summer. And I was really struggling with this decision for a while. And then one night, it was like 2 in the morning. I took out my cards and I just said, okay, should I go or should I stay? And I got the Chariot. Very clear, direct,
Oh,
you
there
know.
you go.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
and I just did one the other day. I've been thinking about resigning from a teaching position because it's just sort of sucking my soul. So the question I asked was,
Mhm.
what would be the likely outcome if I were to resign from this? And I got the 10 of cups. So that's a nice
Oh,
positive card,
nice.
right? But after I moved here over the summer, I had all these self doubts. And so I did a single card reading where I'm like, did I make the right choice? And I pulled the Fool. And initially I'm like, oh, new adventure, new beginning. And I'm like, but wait a minute, it's the Fool. There's that ambiguity in there. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to share that
You
because
know, yeah, I read reversals. So I don't know if you, not everybody does,
yeah,
which for the person who doesn't know tarot, reversals are when the card is upside down
mm,
and it has a whole different meaning. So pulling the Fool is a great positive
yeah,
card
yeah,
unless he's in reverse.
right.
And then you've got the mistakes, the regrets, the screw up, that I was so stupid, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So I say if he's straight up, you're golden.
Yeah, yeah. I usually don't read reversals. I
Mhm.
probably ought to. Sometimes I do, but typically I
I
don't.
think it makes them much more clear to
Yeah.
me. I mean, I think it's a huge loss in what those cards can tell you
Mm,
if you don't read. Now I understand every card has its dignities, you know, it has its positive and negative aspects. And many people look at the reversals as the negative side of it, which is not always true, by the
right.
way. You know, you look at something like the Eight of Swords, which is the lady in the cage, you know, who's tied up and blindfolded in the cage. And in reverse, she's set free. You
Mm,
know, she's released from limiting beliefs or whatever. And so that's a good thing. So reversals are not always, a lot of times people see them as bad, and they're not always bad. But I would, you know, if you've been reading tarot for a while, I would encourage you to
yeah.
explore those reversals because I think
Yeah.
it's going to add a lot of depth to your practice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've been doing it for about 40 years. So, and I've done reversals. I think that the attitude I've had is that most of the reversals you can get the same message from other cards. And that's why I typically don't. But I see what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, and I agree that it could add. And there are different ways of reading the reversals. Like sometimes I've read them as like blocked energy, and I've
Uh-huh.
also
Yeah.
heard it as like this is where the energy is shifting, things like that. So
Mhm.
yeah,
And how the characters interact and
yeah,
face each other, you
right,
know? That was something that the tarot card designer Robert Place taught me when he designed the alchemical tarot, which is probably my favorite deck.
yeah,
And he showed, you know, how this face may be turned to look at, you know,
mhm,
this page may be turned to look at this queen in a certain way, or this king may be turning away from the queen, or, you know, and there's this dynamic even in how the characters are interacting in front of you in the pictures. And it's also interesting, and it all feeds into the meaning that you give
yeah,
the person that you're reading for.
yeah. And one of the things that I really liked about your book as well was it recall one of the ways that I personally practice, and I'll tell the deck I'm just practicing, but I will do practice spreads and look at the
Uh-huh.
cards. And sometimes there are very clear stories that come to me. And
Yeah.
when I read your book, I'm like, that's what I've been doing. because you're
Uh-huh.
finding the story in the cards.
Right, right. And I do talk, I think toward the end in one of the book, in one of the tips, that a lot of times creative people will use tarot cards
Mhm.
to help them to
Yeah.
plot a story, or to, get some character depth, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you made the really interesting observation that when you write and when you are reading the tarot, you kind of go to the same place, to the same mental place, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a zone. It's a meditative place for sure. And yeah, and when I'm telling my own story in the chapter in The Fool, I have this very, I mean, in some ways, I consider it a traditional background. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but it was a charismatic Episcopal church. And one of the things they taught me on a church retreat when I was probably 13 or 14 was automatic writing,
Mm.
and which is essentially channeling. And at that time, they said it was Holy Spirit, and just let the Holy Spirit tell you, and write it down. And I got quite good at it. And, and that's part of my spiritual practice today,
Mm.
whether I'm journaling or writing poetry. I'm also a poet, or working on fiction or nonfiction. Sometimes you get stuck and you just ask spirit to take over, because
Yeah.
you don't necessarily know where it's going. Yeah, and that's where the wisdom is.
Yeah. And well, it's really interesting to when reading the cards, when that story just presents itself and it seems so
Yeah.
clear at times. And I think what's also really interesting is it also demonstrates that the same card can appear in a different story and it can serve a different function or purpose. And it just shows
Mhm.
how rich tarot is.
Yeah, I find a lot of clients will get repeat cards. They'll sit with me for an hour-long session, and we'll ask a number of different subject questions, and the same cards will keep showing up, even with all the shuffling and all the different layouts. And there's like a message that
Mhm.
the tarot is saying, here's your takeaway,
Yeah.
the hermit, you need some time alone, or
Yeah.
something like that. And something to focus on, something to avoid.
Mm.
And we get these repeat cards, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. I've noticed that as well in readings I've done for people. Do you remember your first reading?
The first reading that I gave, or the
Uh,
first reading that I got?
the first reading, the first time you ever read the tarot cards, you bought the cards when you were 16 at this
Mhm.
magic shop.
Yeah. So I don't really remember the first reading.
Okay.
I do remember one of the first readings.
Mm.
And I remember, I was probably around 16, and with my girlfriends. And I remember my friend Chris asking, "Why am I fat?" Teenage girl. And she pulled the Three of Cups in reverse, and
Mm.
we read, that feasting over abundance, and we all just burst out laughing, and like, how perfect is that? And it was like that. I mean, very simple readings back then. I did not profess to have any wisdom of my own, and we were playing with the cards in that fortune teller sort of way
Mm.
back then. But I was learning what they meant, and I did know that I was good at it.
Mm.
And I was, as I said in the book, I soon became everyone's favorite party guest. And it was like, bring your cards, bring your cards. And so it just was a natural thing for me, in the same way that some people are very good at baseball or something.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And so it was the success that you were having at the parties and whatnot that led you to do this professionally then.
Right, right. Over a long period of time. I mean, so, I've had so many different careers. I've been in the corporate world. I ran a music magazine in the 1990s. I've been in fitness. I've been a reporter and journalist. And tarot was with me through all of that. I have an unpublished book about my years running the music magazine as a single mom. It's called Night Times, and I do hope to publish that maybe even soon. But part of our staff meetings, after all the business was conducted, we broke out the tarot cards,
Mm.
and I read for everybody who worked with me, and we had a blast. And it was just always a part of me, and a part of, and I never really thought about charging for it for a long time, not until graduate school, which was, I started graduate school as a creative writer in poetry and fiction in 2007. And back then I had a professor, and he was just very encouraging of me. He liked my tarot cards, and I brought him to class, and he would have me come to some of his other classes and read, and he would he would sort of mix my cards in with the theme of the class. So he might be doing like the mystical poets or something,
Mm.
and he'd bring me in to read for his students in that class. And it just got to a point that everyone wanted me for their parties or their weddings or what have you, that I had to start charging. And that was really when I took the step into being professional. And I was just doing it part-time for a number of years. Certainly all through graduate school, it was just part-time. And I became a professor, a university professor, and it was still a part-time gig. But it got to the point that the demand was so great, and honestly, the school was getting me down. The administrative duties and the unpaid hours, and yeah, I don't have to tell you about all that. You mentioned you teach too.
Yeah.
So it just made more sense to be a full-time tarot card reader.
Mm.
And so I let that go, and it's been the best thing to ever happen to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of always in the back of my mind too. It's like, I could do that. It's not as soul sucking as higher education can be.
Yeah, it doesn't feel as safe, it's true.
Yeah.
You don't know, there
Right.
is not a promised check at the end of the
Right.
week or 2 weeks,
Right.
but there's so much joy.
Mm.
And if, I had to learn a lot about valuing myself and my
Mhm.
time, and not being afraid to ask for money. I mean, that was
Yeah.
like a huge thing for me when I
Right.
was first going professional. I felt embarrassed to ask for money. I was like, oh, if you really want to give me something, but
Mm.
I wasn't looking at, when clients are lining up, there's only one of you, and you
Right.
have to value your time.
Sure.
And so it was, it's been a learning experience just going pro.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Now, one of the things that you wrote in the book I wanted to ask about because I could also relate to this. And you begin one of the chapters with this sentence, wedding receptions used to make me physically ill. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's funny just to read that out of context. But the idea
Uh-huh.
of doing all of the readings, it does sap the energy from you. So
Yeah. And it's an emotional roller coaster.
yeah. Yeah. So how do you protect yourself?
Well, so again, not very, I'm not a very superstitious person. I'm not really big into ceremony and
Yeah.
ritual so much as before an event, I close my eyes and I get centered, and I ask to be a channel of love and light, and only let love and light in, and give the people what they most need to hear. So I mean, I do that before just an individual reading also, but that's important to me, to just sort of ground myself and pull in my energies and pull in spirit. And I think in my earlier, younger days, I didn't do that. And I was just sort of throwing myself to the forces, you
Yeah.
know? And so something like a wedding, which I talk about all the feelings. There's obviously people who are happy for the bride and groom, but weddings are weird, and they make people look at their own lives. And so you get people who are like, well, I'll never find love, and you get people who are like, oh, I wonder how long they're going to last. And,
Yeah.
there's just every gamut of emotion. And when they're all sitting in front of me, one after another, and it is, as I said, an emotional roller coaster, and it's a lot of energy to take in, a lot of different energy to take in, and it's truly sickening on a
Mm.
physical level.
Yeah.
So not something I like to do very often, honestly.
Right. Yeah, I had a friend who had some of her female business colleagues over. She would do a like once a year, she would have the women come over and they would have a focused intent, day like, vision boards or something like that. And she invited me once to do
Mhm.
readings for them. And at the end of the day, I just had this massive throbbing headache. And so I could understand the aspect of it making you ill. And ever since then, if I ever do anything like that, I'm burning the Palo Santo, and I usually have a spray thing of like a Florida water or something just to help
Uh-huh.
keep it clear, and
Yeah.
take a
Yeah.
little bit of time between the readings too, to kind of let anything go.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right, but we can't do that when we're working a wedding
Right.
reception,
Right.
you gotta move them through,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that host or hostess is paying you good
Mm.
money to get as many of the 200 guests
Wow.
as you
Yeah.
can handle,
Wow.
and they're quick 5-minute readings, which aren't too
Yeah.
deep, and,
Right.
that's usually how those things go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think.
Not a lot of room for self-care.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned this, and I had it written down because I wanted to ask you about this, and I'm wondering if maybe you can say a little bit more. And it was the doing readings for people who've passed on, because I had never actually
Yeah.
thought about that before.
Well, and I hadn't either, and I didn't ever plan to do that. But I had so many clients who would either trick me into it, say, "I want you to read for my friend Jim," and I put down cards, and actually one of those stories is in there in the chariot. And I was like, "Oh gosh, what's going on with Jim? Jim's in a dark place, I've got the 4 of swords, and I've got maybe the death card, and I've got, just, pain and 9 of swords, and, lots of negative stuff." And then the client will say, "Well, he's dead. So yeah, that
Mm,
makes sense."
mm,
So sometimes I would find out they died that way. Sometimes clients would be more open and say, we're wrestling with, the death of a child, or a relative that, we want to come to peace with something about this person. And can you please just look? I've had people say it like that. And I would say, all right, but I'm not a
mm,
medium.
right.
I'm not promising a back and forth conversation here. And they would say, just see what you see. And 9 times out of 10, they'll tell me that's exactly the way he would have said it.
Mm,
Or, yes, you nailed the details of such and such. Or you're describing something, and so I know it works.
mm,
I still don't say I'm a medium.
right.
I don't want that responsibility. I'm not trained in that. I know there's sort of mediumistic training, there's tarot training, and I was never officially trained. I'm
Right.
autodidactic.
Mm,
I learned from a lot of reading and a lot of spiritual study. And I think that all of that feeds into my readings for my clients. I study Kabbalah, I study A Course in Miracles, I study the Tao, and I'm in a Buddhist women's group. I'm really kind of a cafeteria plan of spirituality.
yeah.
And so you're going to get a lot of stories. You're going to get a lot of my Episcopal background, the
Mm,
Christianity. And I think it all fits, it all belongs. And it's embodied in all the tarot cards, all that wisdom. And so some of that is what I've put into this book. A lot of that is. And when I did realize this was going to be a book, part of me was like, do I want to give it all away? Do I want to give all my secrets away? And then I was like, well, of course, because this is to make the world a better place, and this is healing, and it can only bring blessings to me.
mm,
And it could shift me away from being a tarot card reader. I don't know,
mm,
I'd be okay with that. I'd be okay with being more of an author, because writing is really my first love. But I'm a good tarot card reader.
yeah.
and I know I have a lot of wisdom, and people have already been asking me about a sequel with the Minor Arcana, and I'm thinking about it.
Hmm.
So we'll see where that goes. I've got a few
Yeah.
stories yet.
Yeah. Well, you could get 4 sequels out of that because that would be pretty hefty if you did the minor cards. Maybe 1 book for each
Sure.
suit.
Yeah, like one for each of the suits or something.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Just putting it out there for you. One of the things that you also noted in the book, and you actually noted this a couple of times, which I also really appreciated, was that you noted that in your readings, you're really telling people what they already know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I'm just
that is,
mirroring it back.
yeah, that's what I have people tell me
Mhm.
all the time. They're like, you just told me what I already know. And my response is
Yeah.
good,
But they
good.
need it.
Yeah,
Yeah, they need the validation, they need the clarity.
yeah,
And, but they feel it.
yeah,
Yeah, happens all the time.
yeah. Now, you talked about the woman in the Hierophant chapter that you couldn't really read for. You also,
Mhm.
in one of the later chapters, I think it was in the Judgment, with the Judgment card, you wrote about a woman who you ended up not doing a reading for. And you had good reason.
Yeah.
You had good reason, I think. And it took a lot for you to finally say no, it seems.
Mhm,
But I
mhm.
was wondering, are there other situations that you've run into where you have felt that it is inappropriate to do a reading, or is there someone that you wouldn't
Yeah.
do a reading for?
Well, so another reading in the book that I wouldn't do was the man who was having a heart attack,
Yeah,
and his granddaughter was calling me, and and that's not appropriate. I'm not a medical doctor, and I've had people call me asking if they're pregnant. If they're pregnant, that's kind of all in fun usually.
yeah.
So that I'd probably read for that one. But I've had people ask me if they have STDs.
Mm,
I've had people, ask about serious health issues, cancers, tumors, seizures, that's not in the realm, I mean, sure, it could show up, but I cannot diagnose anything.
right,
I cannot heal anything. That poor man in the chapter on the moon card who was having what I believe to be a heart attack, he wanted me to do some kind of spell to fix
right.
him.
Yeah.
And that broke my heart because it wasn't possible. And so in the meantime, I was just trying desperately to get 911 to find him
Mm,
because of course I didn't know who he was or where he lived or any
right.
of that. But yeah, so there are the health ones, generally I refuse.
Mm,
If people don't treat me well, I refuse. If people are intoxicated, I say there's a reason they call it spirits.
mm,
And oh, I remember doing a party once and some girl, well, first of all, when anyone's drunk, they're shouting everything at you. They forget the question they just asked and you're getting the same thing over and over again. And they're famous for they start to read the cards themselves
mm.
and they see something like the death card and they spiral out of control and there's weeping and gnashing of the teeth, and
Yeah,
it's just no, not good energy, not where I want to be. So I usually say right off, I don't read for you if you're drunk. I've tried and it is not a good time for anybody, really.
right. Right. Yeah, no, I understand that. I used to try to read for a friend after a couple margaritas on both of our ends, and it never came out well. So, uh, yeah. But it's interesting because people, even though they're not that familiar with tarot, they sometimes know a little bit, like the death card, and they
Mhm.
don't know enough though to really know that it signifies just, transformation, usually.
Right.
And I think one of my
Right. It's a good card.
yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, one of my favorite chapters in the book, and it was really personal for you, I think, and it's also one of my, weirdly enough, it's one of my favorite cards, is the chapter on the Tower card.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you've
Yeah.
ever
So that was
seen it. Oh, please go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say that was a girl in high school who was cutting herself.
Yeah.
And I was doing one of these midnight lock-ins that I've since said no more of those because I feel like a train hit me the next day.
Yeah.
I'm just too old for those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, teenagers, oh, their energy is so intense.
Mm.
And this one poor girl, just the self-destruction was big. And I knew I was there for a reason, and it was to talk her through, why she might be cutting herself, and, to identify that I knew she was, and to help give her some guidance to possibly stop. And of course, that was the first and last time I ever saw her, so I don't know how
Yeah.
that turned out.
Right.
I pray I made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there was a meme that was going around on the internet once, and uh, it showed the sun card, and it said, "This is what everyone thinks enlightenment is." And then it says, "Oh, but this is what enlightenment really is." And it was the tower card. And I like that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why it's one of my favorite
Yeah.
cards. But I did like that chapter because I think the way it was written, it seems that you were able, I hope that you were able to help that girl. And it was
I hope
very,
so too.
very appropriate.
I know I got through.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. It's that, with tarot, you can help people, you know, and
Mhm.
anyone who
Right.
helps is doing something good, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's meaningful work,
Yeah.
it sure beats, sitting in a cube, and which I've done plenty of that too. And I don't knock it. It's an honest living. And, if you're in the corporate job and you can do it and you like it, God bless you. If you don't like it, I say run. There are better things out there.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I know we're running out of time, but one of the things that I was unaware of, and this is me being very sneaky, kind of getting into our end questions, but you mentioned Sylvia Plath a few times in the book. And I think you
Yeah.
mentioned the collection of poems, Ariel, and that she was
Uh-huh.
using tarot imagery. And I never knew that. And I read Ariel
Yes.
many, many, many years ago.
Yeah. Almost nobody knows this. And when I was in graduate school, my professor, Dr. Stephen Schreiner, had given us a semester end project, and I wasn't finding anything, but I was getting obsessed with Plath, who, to be fair, I'd been reading her since I was 16. Again, that 16-year-old age coming up, always drawn to her work. But in grad school, when I was actually studying her and pulling apart these poems, and I was like, wait a minute, there's all this tarot imagery. And I said to Dr. Schreiner, look, here's the Empress, and this is clearly a Knight of Swords, and this is clearly the Death card, and I'm seeing these patterns. And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, make that your semester end project. Well, that became my life's work.
Mm.
And, fast forward, I've spent, actually, rewind now. I spent the last 15 years in the Plath archives proving it, reading the books that she read and the things that she underlined and her little notes on calendars and all of this wealth of information to substantiate that she was a very practicing mystic. My next book with Destiny Books will be out in May 2024, and that is called The Occult Sylvia Plath. And The Occult Sylvia Plath was originally going to be the introduction to my first book, which came out in 2014, called Fixed Stars Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath. And the introduction was too wieldy. It was her story and all the mysticism between her and her family and Ted Hughes, her husband, and his family. It was just too big of a story for an introduction. So, and it took me many years of research to just, shore it up and make sure that I was exactly right on so many things. So I've been kind of persecuted by the Plath camp in
Mm.
academia. They want to hold her to her tidy little depressive suicidal self.
Mm.
And when you learn to see how she aligned these poems with the tarot cards, and then you understand the meaning of the tarot cards, and like it expands the meaning of her poems exponentially. I found at least 6 clear different meanings to every poem in Ariel, all in alignment with the tarot cards.
Mm.
And she was a genius's genius. And she milked her words to the max, like I just don't know any poet who was capable of doing what she did. Her husband, Ted Hughes, maybe came close. But as I say in the occult Sylvia Plath, she was the magician's apprentice who became stronger than the magician.
Mm.
And it's funny because she has this line in her poem, The Bee Meeting, I am the magician's girl, I do not flinch. And she was tutored by Ted Hughes, but really her background, her father was a Freemason. Her mother's master's thesis was on Paracelsus, the alchemist. She and her mother read all of these mystical books back and forth, and I've read most of them that they've read, and I've actually seen her annotations and her underlinings, and so that book is all about that. But she was absolutely a mystic writer.
Mm. Yes. Yeah, that was me very sneakily kind of leading up to what's coming up next, because I told you before
Yeah.
before we began recording that I was looking through the catalog for the books that are coming out in winter and spring. And when I saw the occult Sylvia Plath, I can't even begin to tell you how excited I was. That was the one of
I'm
all
so
the other
glad. A
books I
lot of
was looking
people,
forward to.
yeah, a lot of people don't know her, it seems you have to have a little bit of a literary education,
Mm,
probably, this generation isn't reading poetry like
mm,
previous generations, and fiction. I mean, she
right,
of course wrote The Bell Jar,
right.
which was one of the great American novels. I mean, Plath covered it all. But yeah, it seems like it's going to be really well received. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I am too. So I hope that when it's released, you'll come back and we can go into more depth about that book. I think I would very much love to talk to you about
I
that.
would love to.
Yeah, wonderful. So, do you have anything else that's coming up other than the release of the Sylvia Plath book?
Well, the audiobook for Tarot Life Lessons should be released very soon. I don't have an exact date, but it could be before the end of November here. I'm not sure when. I recorded it in my own voice, which was important to me. I actually, that was kind of an interesting thing into itself because I had to audition to read my own book, which I thought was funny. But I wanted to read it and say my own words and my own experiences. So that's coming. Right now I am busy recording the audiobook for the occult Sylvia Plath. So that will have an audiobook with it as well. And really, my whole life right now is in finishing that. So, and getting through the holiday job because I have a lot of events for the holidays. But yeah, that's what I've got going on. I know it's probably not too fascinating, but
Oh no, that's no,
but that's
seriously, the that Sylvia Plath book, that is excitement enough. That is,
yeah,
yeah, that's I'm looking forward to that. So,
great.
do you have a website where people can go to find out more about you and
I
your work?
do. I do. It is in the process of being remade, but it's still functional. It's my name. It's juliagordonbramer.com, and I'll spell that Juliagordon, B as in boy, RAM as in Mary, ER.com. And they can find me there. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at J Gordon Bramer, with the Gordon-Bramers, no hyphens, no periods, none of that in both the website and the Twitter and the Instagram. And they can look me up also on Facebook. I'm there as well. Just put my
Okay.
name in.
All right, wonderful. I will put the link for your website in the show notes and the video description and the social media as well. And also put in links for the
Great.
tarot book as well.
Okay. Thank you,
Yeah.
Nick.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been a joy speaking with you. The book, Pro Life Lessons, was a joy to read. It's a fun read. And you can actually learn a little bit about tarot by reading it, even though it's not a how-to book.
Yeah,
Yeah. So thank you.
exactly.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap on episode 116 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're part of my YouTube audience. Now, you know what's coming, all the usual. Sign up for my Patreon, share this with friends and family, coworkers, and on social media. subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. You know the grind. But here's the thing, all of that is really important. Putting this podcast together takes a lot of time and effort. Right now, it is a labor of love. I'm in the process of making changes to improve the podcast and the YouTube channel. It's slow going, but your support will help me speed up the process and ensure that I can continue with the podcast and offer much more content than what I do now. As I always like to say, I'm here in the Front Range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality, and ecology, psychedelics and consciousness, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me in my efforts to share the good news. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.